Hello again. In the last two videos, we've concentrated on non-state actors, multinational enterprises, financial corporations, and transnational advocacy groups as factors in the international system. In this video, I want to turn our attention back to the state, but in a form of organisation where they share in making decisions and share in the consequences of those decisions. In a period of globalization, when, according to some commentators, the power of the state is being eroded, groups of states across the globe are trying to consolidate their positions by closer cooperation. Efforts at greater international cohesion are evident all over the globe, from ASEAN in Southeast Asia, Mercosur in Latin America, SADC in South Africa, and I'm sure you can name many more. But the most ambitious and most advanced of these is the European Union. It's extended its membership from 6 countries in the 1950s to 28 today, and it's expanded its remit from the formation of a customs union to wider concerns of economic and monetary union, as well as tackling social and security issues. So in this video, only as an example, but we're going to concentrate on the European Union. The European Union is supranational, supra meaning above the nation. The concept implies the surrender of national sovereignty over certain issues. The state can no longer be certain about shaping its policies. Thus, the European ministers can reach decisions by qualified majority voting, and those decisions, once taken and approved by the European Parliament, automatically take the force of law in each of the member states. And a final feature of the arrangements is that only the European Commission is entitled to make any proposals. It controls the setting of the agenda for discussions. The achievements of the EU are many. It's implemented a common market with no frontier barriers to trade, with shared regulations, with free movements of labour of capital, and with common competition rules. It's constructed and partially dismantled a common agricultural policy, and it's formed a currency union among some of its members. It has also helped the transformation of the former socialist countries of East Central Europe and has nursed them towards full membership. It is much stronger in international trade and financial negotiations than if each of these countries had acted independently. And, perhaps most important of all, it has curbed nationalist, protectionist tendencies and beggar-thy-neighbour policies in the member states. Now, not all of these achievements have been universally popular, but most would have been completely unthinkable in the early 1950s, when the first tentative steps towards European integration were made. And yet the European Union is not really loved. Now, there's a nice concept in political science literature called input and output legitimacy. Output legitimacy means that citizens are happy because they're getting the public goods they want. And input legitimacy means that citizens are content because they feel they've contributed towards the decisions being made. For a long time, the EU has relied on output legitimacy, but especially after the euro crisis, citizens have begun to question some of the policy choices that have been made. And at this point, the absence of input legitimacy comes into play. But of course, you'd say the European citizen is involved in decision makings. The ministers representing them in the European Union have all been elected in national elections. But this idea of a mandated democracy is somewhat contrived. And the citizens also involved in the direct elections to the European Parliament. But that only managed to galvanise about 42% of the electorate entitled to vote, the lowest ever recorded. Much of the problem lies that the issues discussed by the European Parliament. First of all, the EU doesn't spend much money, slightly over 1% of the Union's GDP, and so the usual tax and spend issues that form the day-to-day business of politics is missing. And the European Parliament cannot easily bring down the government, I suppose the European Commission, a body with one place reserved for a nominee of each member state. But if democratic control and democratic legitimacy is weak, who does make EU policy? Well, most analysts would argue that the main players are the member states. And despite lurid headlines to the contrary, no one single large power determines the overall direction. For a long time it was suggested that the French-German axis was necessary to get things done, or more recently that Germany has been the most powerful force. But there's little evidence of consistent domination by any power or group of powers. It's interesting that small states, or at least the academics studying smaller states, seem to be quite in favour of the European Union, certainly in comparison with a situation where they'd be exposed to big power politics in the context of bilateral negotiations. But let's stay with the question of who does make policy. Well, the simple answer is the national government and the European Parliament agreeing together, and the European Commission, which prepares and presents the legislation. So if you want to influence policy, you should really approach all three institutions, preferably simultaneously. At first sight, the easiest to influence is the national government, through the national press, through political parties, and through the members of national parliaments. But by itself, this route is the least likely to bring any rewards, since there's still 27 other states to get on side. So a much better way is to approach the officials in the European Commission and get the bits of legislation slotted in before it's even published. The levels of chemicals permitted, the banned substances, the safety stipulation, the exact concessions in trade negotiations. Try to get them all there before anyone can do anything about it. At the same time, you could tackle the European Parliament's specialist committees, established to examine fields of legislation. Parliament tends to vote in party blocks, so win one or two of those over and your legislation is home and dry. There are 30,000 lobbyists active in Brussels, and the Commission works particularly closely with the business lobby. The Directorate in charge of trade negotiations, active right now, for example, in negotiating trade deals with India and the USA, works especially closely with big business. Many of the so-called expert groups formed by the Commission are top-loaded with business representatives, often with members' affiliations being deliberately misrepresented. An academic with ties to industry being labelled as independent, for example. Not surprisingly, corporate business interests are conspicuously overrepresented in the expert groups called to consider taxation and customs union, and the group advising on enterprise and industry, as well as the group advising the Secretary General, which guides the overall direction of policy. Well-paid firms of lobbyists offer briefing papers to the members of the European Parliament and try to maintain links with those involved in scrutinising different types of legislation. In all of these areas, small and medium enterprises, trade unions and civic advocacy groups are seriously underrepresented. And if we add to this the fact that monetary policy is settled by the European Central Bank in Frankfurt, and that is also under the sway and influence of financial interests, and you can see that we've really got a problem. So let's sum up. In this video, we've looked particularly at the problems and achievements of supranationality as embodied in the European Union. We've exposed the problems of input and output legitimacy, and we've questioned the disproportionate role of corporate interests in influencing policy. If we tie together what we've been discussing this week, then we can say the following. Political economy is about the relationship of the economy to politics and society, and much of what it discusses is related to power. You don't have to be a revolutionary to be concerned about the situation that we've described. These are issues that call for democratic control, that call for citizens to reassert their command over the societies in which they live. And the lesson is really fairly simple. If you don't like the look of the world which we've configured, do something positive about it, however small. Try to change it. It's time for us all together to start to reconfigure the world.